Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the finale of the 2022 Deep Read with the author of the acclaimed Transcendent Kingdom, Yaa Gyasi, in conversation with our own distinguished scholar and writer, Karen Te Yamashita. I am very happy to be here this afternoon. I had the honor of taking part in last week's Deep Read Faculty Salon with two very talented professors, Vilashini Kupan and Gina Athena Ulyssi. It highlighted for me what a wonderful program the Deep Read has become in just its third year. The Deep Read brings together such a varied group of people. UC Santa Cruz students, faculty, and staff, as well as our alumni and community members. It's a very powerful way to come together in community. We had about 7,000 readers this year. That's just fantastic. This program is headed up by Irina Pollack, Managing Director of the Humanities Institute. She does this work in conjunction with the literature professor, Sean Kylan, and lecturer Laura Martin. But the program is truly a labor of love for dozens of people across our campus. It could not have grown into what it is today without a host of campus and community partners. Among them is our College Scholars Program, the Division of Student Affairs and Success, the Living Writers Series, our Council of Provosts, the University Library, and University Relations. Bookshop Santa Cruz is a big supporter, and this is the first year we've had two local high schools involved, Santa Cruz High and the Pacific Collegiate School. The program is made possible through a generous support of the Helen and Will Webster Foundation. I'm grateful to the foundation for its continued support of our campus, and we do so many things at UC Santa Cruz that are very special, and the Webster family is usually at the center of them. So thank you to everybody involved. This program has quickly become a campus treasure. It's now my pleasure to introduce our Dean of the Humanities, Jasmine Allender. Dean Allender is an interdisciplinary, community-engaged history scholar. The overarching themes that unite her work are human rights and civil liberties. Her work as dean is grounded in her belief that it's essential in the future of democracy. She is a deep believer in the power of public-facing, community-engaged humanities projects like the Deep Read. Please welcome Jasmine Allender.
Good afternoon. You can respond back. Good afternoon. Wonderful to see you all. Welcome. Let's give one more round of applause to the drummers, please. My thanks to Chancellor LaRive for supporting this program and for her participation in the Faculty Salon, which was, I think, a wonderful reminder of how scientists and humanists can enrich the lives of all of us through mutual conversation. So I want to reiterate the welcome of the Chancellor to this culminating event of the 2022 Deep Read, and I would like to begin with the UCSC land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking Yupi tribe. The Yamamutsan tribal band, composed of the descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. We're in this beautiful quarry, but we're not in a bubble, and I want to also acknowledge the lives lost yesterday, almost all of them Black, in Buffalo. Could you please join me in a moment of silence to honor those lives and affirm that Black lives matter? We need more than the humanities to build a just, anti-racist future, but the humanities are essential to any such future. There are solutions that only people working in the humanities can provide. There are ideas that can only be conceived of and conveyed through the humanities, questions, debates, conversations about what it means to be human, to be alive, to work to transform society for the better. In the humanities, we study the world as it has been, we critique the world as it is, and we imagine and create the engaged, inclusive democracy we aspire to be. The Deep Read is a signature program of the Humanities Institute, one that invites us to read together and reflect on the most pressing issues of our day. In addition to this final event with the author, the Deep Read consists of guided discussions, salons led by campus faculty, a community message board, and a credit-bearing course for undergraduates. Since its inception, the Deep Read has grown, as you know now, to over 7,000 Deep Readers in Santa Cruz, the Bay Area, Los Angeles, across the country, and the globe. This is my second year at UCSC, and it's my third Deep Read. How many of you have been to all three? Welcome to the first in-person culminating event in the Quarry. So our first Deep Read brought us together virtually to read Margaret Atwood's The Testaments. Our second Deep Read last year brought us together virtually to read Tommy Orange's There, There. And I think reading collectively and reflecting on books with community and campus experts provides such important opportunities for connection, particularly during the time of pandemic that has too often required periods of isolation. Our plans for the future of the Deep Read include growing partnerships with regional community colleges and more high schools. We remain committed to developing enriching public-facing programming that demonstrates the vital role that the humanities play in forging communities of readers who share deep and collective responsibilities with each other and the world. I, too, am grateful to everyone who's taken part in and supported the Deep Read project. I want to reiterate the Chancellor's gratitude to Irina Polich and Sean Kylan, Laura Martin, Carrie Napolis, and Adam Jacobson of Talk Shop LA. I'd also like to thank our university events and our Quarry staff. Free public events like this are made often possible by the generous contributions of donors, and I would like to add my sincere appreciation to the Helen and Will Webster Foundation for their support of the Deep Read and the Humanities Institute. It's now an honor for me to introduce Yaa Gyasi and Karente Yamashita. Yaa Gyasi is the author of the highly acclaimed debut novel Homegoing and a recipient of the National Book Foundation's 2016 5 Under 35 Award. Gyasi was born in Ghana and raised in Huntsville, Alabama. She holds a BA in English from Stanford University and an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she held a Dean's Graduate Research Fellowship. Her second novel, Transcendent Kingdom, was published in September 2020, and she lives in New York City. Karente Yamashita is a National Book Award nominated author of 8 books and the Edward A. Dixon Professor Emerita in UCSC's Literature and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies departments. Professor Yamashita has received many national awards, which acknowledge both her brilliant writing and her commitment to an exploration of underrepresented voices in literature. Those awards include the 2018 John Dos Passos Prize, and in 2021, the National Book Foundation awarded her the Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters. Her most recent book, Sense and Sensibility, was published in 2020. So a few housekeeping notes. There will be time after the conversation for audience Q&A. Please write your questions on the note cards you were given on your way in, or raise your hand if you still need a card and one of our volunteers will bring them to you. This event is being recorded for archival purposes, and if you missed it, there is a water station if it gets a little toasty by the entrance. Finally, again, from the start, it has always been the intention of the organizers for the Deep Read to culminate here in this beautiful space in the Quarry. It's 2022, and finally we are here together. With that, I invite Yaa and Karen to take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Thank you, Chancellor Cindy, and also Dean Jasmine. Thank you so much. It's beautiful to be here. What a beautiful day, and what a lovely space here in the Quarry. I'm so glad that we can all be here outside. I'm going to keep my my dark glasses on, if you don't mind. My eyes are really dry, but also I need that too. And I want to thank Sean Kylan, Professor Sean Kylan, and Laura Martin, and also Irena Polik. Thank you so much to the, wait a minute, you call yourselves the Humanities Institute now, right? At UC Santa Cruz. It's very special to be here, and thank you for organizing this. So lovely to meet you and to be here with you.
Wow.
I thought I'd start by asking you to say your name.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. So my full name is Yaa Gyasi.
Yako.
Nyako is my middle name, yeah.
Oh, okay. I was thinking, and we were talking earlier, about how names are significant, especially to writers who spend a lot of time naming our characters. I don't know about you, but I do, and sometimes it takes hours and days. But also I think our parents named us because of their hope for the future. So maybe you can tell me something about your name.
Sure. Well, Yaa is what is sometimes referred to as a soul name, by which we mean many Akan people give their kids day of the week names. So it's the name that you bring with you into the world. So Yaa is the name for a girl born on Thursday. So now you all know what day I was born. My parents chose not to give me an English name, which is a common practice still, so I don't have an English name. But Nyako comes from my grandmother, so that was her last name. And people in my family often call me Mame, because I'm named after my father's mother.
I love that. Thank you so much. You know, I want to start maybe to ask you about your first novel, Homegoing, which was published in 2016. And while the big, or I guess we're calling this the deep read, I thought it was a big read, deep read in Santa Cruz has focused on your second work, Transcendent Kingdom, I believe that readers should also be familiar with your previous work. And Homegoing is a capacious and a really big history. I think it requires a much longer discussion and another deep read. But can you give us a sense of or an introduction to that work?
Sure. So Homegoing is a novel that follows the family lineages of two half-sisters born in Ghana in the 18th century. The first sister, Afia, becomes the wife of the British governor of the Cape Coast Castle, which was the kind of the seat of British colonial rule in the Gold Coast. The second sister is kept in that same castle as an enslaved person before being sent through the Middle Passage to America. So the novel goes down the line, generation after generation, through Ghana and the US, following the descendants of these two women. It's a book that started for me through a research trip that I took to Ghana my sophomore year of college. So it was really quite the labor of research and love and history and all of that.
It certainly is. I wonder if you could maybe read a short segment from the book. This is Homegoing.
And I'll just read from the very beginning. The night Afia Otre was born into the musky heat of Fanti land, a fire raged through the woods just outside her father's compound. It moved quickly, tearing a path for days. It lived off the air. It slept in caves and hidden trees. It burned up and through, unconcerned with what wreckage it left behind, until it reached an Ashanti village. There, it disappeared, becoming one with the night. Afia's father, Kobi Ocher, left his first wife, Baba, with the new baby so that he might survey the damage to his yams, that most precious crop known far and wide to sustain families. Kobi had lost 7 yams, and he felt each loss as a blow to his own family. He knew then that the memory of the fire that burned, then fled, would haunt him, his children, and his children's children for as long as the line continued. When he came back into Baba's hut to find Afia, the child of the night's fire, shrieking into the air, he looked at his wife and said, "We will never again speak of what happened today." I'll stop there.
Beautiful, thank you. In Homegoing, I believe you accomplish a really complex meeting of two sides of the Atlantic slave trade. The roots and the crossing of the Gold Coast to the American South. And it's truly a transatlantic binding of two families, or families and people, even if finally unknown to each other. And for me, I think that the story is a reconciliation on so many levels of race and gender, and yes, certainly culture and language. And also intertribal hostilities in the complicity and evils of the slave trade. And it's a very ambitious endeavor. It's so amazing that that's your first novel. Congratulations. I mean, please, everyone, take a look. It's amazing.
Thank you.
So as a writer, I was interested in the genealogy of the family that you place at the beginning of this book. And I believe you've said that genealogy was or is indeed the structure of the book. Can you talk about that process?
Yeah, absolutely. It took me many years of working to kind of figure out what this book wanted to be. After I took that research trip to Ghana, I remember I took a tour of the Cape Coast Castle. Anyone can take the tour. They still give it freely to this day. And I remember the tour guide walking us around the top levels and talking about how the British soldiers used to marry the local women, which was something I hadn't really thought about before, but suddenly I'm thinking about all the Ghanaians I know with names like Mills and York. I was like, okay, that makes sense. And then from there, he takes us down to see the dungeons. And so we're standing in this room that is no bigger than this stage, and trying to imagine the fact that there were hundreds in that case it was the female dungeon, hundreds of women being kept in this tiny space at once. And I remember immediately thinking, what did these two floors know of each other? What did the free women up above know about what was going on down below? That was the beginning for me. But because I'm not a very good pre-planner, I had no idea how to work my way into it. And so the first few drafts of the novel, it was much more traditionally structured. It was set in the present, and then it just flashed back to 18th century Ghana. But as I worked, the longer I worked, the more I realized that what I was really interested in was being able to think about the way that things like colonialism and slavery changed over time, this idea that we're still kind of living with the ramifications of these things. And I felt like a genealogy, a multi-generational novel would be the best way to show that. And so suddenly the structure kind of emerged, it appeared from there. And so I wrote the first 2 chapters without really thinking about it. They kind of came out in a rush. And then from there, I made the family tree. It looks a lot like the one that's at the front of the book now, except mine also had dates and then maybe like one thing that was happening historically during each time period. And that was kind of my outline. That's how I moved through the novel. But I would say that was about 3 years into the process of writing that I figured out that's what I wanted to do.
That's amazing and really incredible. And I know how hard that was. It presents itself as a genealogical form or structure against this huge panorama of time and a vast history. And it could seem to be simple, but it's not. I know that was a very intricate and complex process. So I think of this as a really impressive achievement. So can you talk about the process of research?
Sure.
Okay.
For Homegoing, the research process was, I would say, like, I wanted to keep the research as backgrounded and atmospheric as possible. I felt very strongly that the book shouldn't be 1,000 pages. I didn't want it to be something that was really hard to get through. Like, I wanted people to be able to feel that full sweep of history in one go. And I felt that if it started to get so weighted down by the research that I needed to know what color shoes they might have been wearing during 1945 such and such place, that it would make the book too rigid. And so what I decided to do was to research and write as I went. And so I began each chapter by researching the time period. If I had that historical marker, I would research that specific thing. So for a chapter like Kojo's chapter, it was the Fugitive Slave Act. For Akuya's chapter, it was the Yaa War. But sometimes it was much more vague than that. For H's chapter, all I had written was Reconstruction / Jim Crow. So, just kind of trying to find things about that period. And then I would do the research, write the chapter, and try to forget about the research. And each subsequent draft, if I needed more information, I would fill it in from there. But yeah, I knew it could easily be like a 10-year research project, and I didn't want that. So I tried to keep the writing front of mind.
So what is marked in this when you're talking about it's storytelling, right? Yeah. What about you in storytelling? I mean, can you talk about that? Because you're a storyteller. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I had lunch with some students earlier, which was really lovely, and they asked me why I wanted to become a writer. And for me, it's really just about how much I love books. I just love reading so very much. And I think even from a young age, I was always trying to figure out how to do the thing that I was seeing. Like, I don't think of myself like as a good storyteller in person, but when I sit down and write, suddenly I can think like a reader because I am primarily a reader first, and I think that's an advantage for the writing. Like, it's important to me that people can finish a book that I've written, that they want to come back to it, that it's not something that they set aside. And I think those kind of skills come from my love of reading.
When I've been thinking about this, because here we are in a university, and I think about my colleagues, I think academics are, well, I guess I'm an academic too, in that sense, I have to admit. But we are sometimes so concerned with ideas that we fail to immerse ourselves in stories. And I think that stories, by their very nature, lift us into the realm of ideas and thinking. And I think that's what I feel about your work. That realm is a different place of knowing that can also cleanse and solve our pain. And it leads us to empathy and also to change. So there are some subjects within Homegoing that I'd like to also explore, and I think they are the subjects of forgiveness and reconciliation, but also the understanding that the body does not forget evil and unfreedom. So I want to explore these ideas, but I think now's the time to move to your other book, Transcendent Kingdom. And I'm also assuming that this book was chosen for the deep read, but is also known to the audience. I hope most of you have read it, yeah? But for those of you who have not, let's just give a brief summary of the story. So there is Gifty, who is a PhD student at Stanford. She's studying neuroscience. Tell us more.
She's studying neuroscience, specifically reward-seeking behavior, so things like addiction and depression. And this work is quite personal to her, though she probably wouldn't admit that. But it's personal to her because her mother is going through a second bout of major depressive disorder when we meet her, and because her older brother passed away from a heroin overdose. So it's a book about family, religion, immigration, and really about what it means to try to make a life in a senseless world, or a world in which senseless things happen.
You want to read?
Sure. This is also just from the beginning. Whenever I think of my mother, I picture a queen-sized bed with her lying in it, a practiced stillness filling the room. For months on end, she colonized that bed like a virus. The first time, when I was a child, and then again when I was a graduate student. The first time, I was sent to Ghana to wait her out. While there, I was walking through Kejitia Market with my aunt when she grabbed my arm and pointed. "Look, a crazy person," she said in Twi. "Do you see a crazy person?" I was mortified. My aunt was speaking so loudly, and the man, tall, with dust caked into his dreadlocks, was within earshot. I see, I answered in a low hiss. The man continued past us, mumbling to himself as he waved his hands about in gestures that only he could understand. My aunt nodded, satisfied, and we kept walking past the hordes of people gathered in that agoraphobia-inducing market until we reached the stall where we would spend the rest of the morning attempting to sell knockoff handbags. Even now, I don't completely understand why my aunt singled the man out to me. Maybe she thought there were no crazy people in America, that I had never seen one before. Or maybe she was thinking about my mother, about the real reason I was stuck in Ghana that summer, sweating in a stall with an aunt I hardly knew while my mother healed at home in Alabama. I was 11, and I could see that my mother wasn't sick, not in the ways that I was used to. I didn't understand what my mother needed healing from. I didn't understand, but I did. And my embarrassment at my aunt's loud gesture had as much to do with my understanding as it did with the man who had passed us by. My aunt was saying that is what crazy looks like. But instead, what I heard was my mother's name. What I saw was my mother's face, still as lake water, the pastor's hand resting gently on her forehead, his prayer a light hum that made the room buzz. I'm not sure I know what crazy looks like, but even today, when I hear the word, I picture a split screen. The dreadlocked man in Kejitie on one side, my mother lying in bed on the other. I think about how no one at all reacted to that man in the market, not in fear or disgust, nothing, save my aunt who wanted me to look. He was, it seemed to me, at perfect peace, even as he gesticulated wildly, even as he mumbled. But my mother, in her bed, infinitely still, was wild inside. I'll stop there.
You dedicate this book to Tina, and I assume she's Christina Kim, who is in your acknowledgments. Can you talk about that friendship and why and how you immersed yourself in her research and in the process for writing this book?
Yeah, my friend Christina Kim, I've known her since high school, and we had very kind of parallel lives at the time. She was also super interested in writing and literature, but just a brilliant all-around person. When she got to school, to college, she started focusing on science and went straight from undergrad to a neuroscience PhD. And I was living in San Francisco at the time that she started her PhD at Stanford. And I remember she would always explain her work to me as being about addiction and depression in layman's terms, lay people terms, but I didn't really know what that meant. Homegoing came out. She was incredibly supportive of that. I was working on a second novel that was going nowhere. And around that same time, Tina had a paper that was due to be published. I asked if I could read it, sat down to read it, and could not understand a single word of it. And so really just out of curiosity, I didn't think I was going to write anything. I just asked her if I could go shadow her in her lab to see what she did all day. And she very kindly said yes, so I went. That day she performed a surgery on her mice. I'll save you the pictures. They're quite, if you're squeamish, you wouldn't want to see them. But it was really fascinating to me, and more fascinating, I think, to see this person that I know and love in this completely different context than I'm used to seeing her in, and to see the way that she lit up in that context. And so I think I kind of stored it away. And years later, when I sat down to write, I thought, what if I write about a neuroscientist? So that was the beginning of Transcendent Kingdom for me. Was Tina's work, and she was very, very helpful throughout the process, like answering all of my, I'm sure to her, very simple questions. And she also read drafts and helped me in that way.
So would you say that her research, Tina's neuroscience research, is maybe the form or the scaffolding upon which you hang your story?
Absolutely. I mean, it almost felt like a writer's prompt of a novel, like write a book about a woman who studies addiction and depression. Obviously, there are a million ways to go with that, but I thought it would be nice to have the person be invested in that because of a personal history with it. And so suddenly the brother and the mother emerge. But I wouldn't have gotten there without Tina's work first. Yeah.
You write, or Gifty says, what's the point of all of this? Is a question that separates humans from other animals. Our curiosity around this issue has sparked everything from science to literature to philosophy, to religion. And I think indeed your story allows us to interlink and cross and ponder those spaces of science and literature and philosophy and religion. And I think that's why the book was chosen for the deep read, because these are intersections of the science of the mind and the humanity of the mind. But through the perception of a young woman and an African immigrant who enters a racist America. So this is a sweeping or perhaps even rhetorical question, but can we think of your book as a quest to decolonize the protagonist Gifty's mind and perhaps ultimately the readers or our minds?
I like that. I like that as an idea for what the book is trying to do. You know, Gifty's a really difficult character, in part because she has so many walls up, but she's also so isolated within all of these communities that are supposed to be welcoming to her. I think of her as someone who's dealing with a lot of internalized racism, certainly a lot of internalized colonialism, and really trying to figure out how to break free from that. And throughout the novel, you see her making these decisions where you kind of want to shake her and say, get help, you know? But I think she can't see it because she is so stuck within those frameworks. She even says at a moment, she's talking about, she's just overheard two women at her church talking about her brother, and she calls this moment a spiritual wound, and she says it takes her years to find and address it. And I think this book is that process, like her trying to find and address all of these wounds that she's just kind of covered up.
She has to try to become sane in an insane place. Also, maybe the question of what makes the brain or the soul sick. Yeah. And then you write, or Gifty speaks, most of the time in my work, I begin with the answers, with an idea of the results. I suspect, I work toward that suspicion, experimenting, tinkering, until I find out what I'm looking for. The ending, the answer, is never the hard part. The hard part is trying to figure out what the question is, trying to ask something interesting enough, different enough from what has already been asked. So here, I understand that Gifty speaks of hypothesis as a basis for scientific work. But in fact, it seems really to be about finding the right question or the right questions. So in writing this project, what were your questions?
So many questions, but I think the main one was about grief, and how we kind of move on or don't from early traumas, and also thinking about how we are informed by intergenerational trauma, how we kind of wind up with things that belong to our parents and things that probably belonged to their parents, which is really the same as Homegoing. That same question runs through that book as well. And as I mentioned before, just the process of how we make sense out of a life in which senseless things happen. So what meaning making means to each of these characters. Those were my questions.
I also think that a personal question of Gifty was to answer why addiction. So, for example, the mice in Gifty's lab learned to drink Ensure. Have you drunk Ensure? My mother used to drink it. Yeah, I don't think she liked it. Anyway, the mice get addicted to drinking Ensure. And then when shock or pain is applied to the consuming of Ensure, some mice continue to drink it despite the associated pain. So Gifty says, I understood that the same thing that made humans great, our recklessness and creativity and curiosity, was also the thing that hampered the lives of everything around us. So what is interesting and beautiful about humans is their creativity and their curiosity and risk-taking, even in the face of danger. But there are risks, for example, of addiction. So what if we do cure addiction? If we cure the urge to take risks, should we cure this?
What a big question. It's such a big what if, like it feels so impossible. Even though obviously, as we've learned, there are people who are working on this, on these very topics. But at any rate, I don't know if it would be possible to kind of curb the human desire to take risks, which I associate as being part of that desire, just to know more than what we can currently know. And that curiosity, I think, is so crucial to how anything gets done in any field. You know, Gifty's talking about science, but I think that's why we write, that's why we make art, this understanding that there's something beyond the seeable world, the knowable. And if I just kind of keep worrying it, maybe I'll get a little closer to finding what that is. I would hate to see that squashed, and that means that you have to take a risk or do something, again, that's kind of beyond what's been done or what's been known. And so I don't know that I would want to see that go away, even if we, cured all the problems that come along with it. I'd hope that there was a way to retain that sense of curiosity.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that that's the question that I kept thinking about in the book. Like, can science really distinguish between the brain cell for addictive behavior and as a different one for creative behavior? I don't know.
I don't know the answer.
I don't know. We're writers,
yeah.
So we keep thinking about these things. There are moments of satire that are believed that are connected to writers. So you're writing from the point of view of a science person, and then there are funny moments. And so, for example, there's a parody of the conversation of literature cultural studies graduate students. That's hilarious. But I had to laugh at this page. Most other science majors I knew took intro to creative writing courses to fulfill the requirement. It's an easy A. But instead, Gifty takes a seminar on Jared Manley Hopkins. And she says, I hated poetry, but I felt a strange sense of kinship with Hopkins. Aside from the idea that I find it hard to believe that there's a single poet seminar on this white guy, but it's Harvard. But who is Hopkins, and why is he in your story?
This is where I reveal my own obsession with Hopkins, which it wasn't a seminar solely on Hopkins, but in college I took a seminar on Wordsworth and Hopkins and realized I loved Hopkins way more than Wordsworth. He's a poet who really, I think, plays with a lot of alliteration. Like he's very fun to memorize and fun to kind of say. But he was also incredibly tortured about writing poetry, so much so that he burned most of his poems. And so there's so much of his work that we'll never know. And this tortured feeling came from his religiosity. He was a very religious man, and wasn't sure if he could kind of, if he could reconcile the part of him that wanted to write these poems with the part of him that wanted to serve God. And even as much as I love his poems, I think his journals are really fascinating too, because of that torturedness. And it felt so fitting for this novel to think about Hopkins, because Gifty has some of that within her as well. This kind of pull between the religion of her childhood and the work that she does.
All right, so working off that, can you talk about Gifty's upbringing in the Assembly of God, about evangelical Christianity as professed and adhered to by the mother?
Yeah, so Gifty grows up Pentecostal because her mother is deeply devout, and her mother practices this religion in Ghana and comes to America, winds up in Huntsville, and just kind of plops them all in the first church that she finds, which turns out to be a predominantly white church in Huntsville. And so Gifty's upbringing within this church is always kind of laced with the microaggressions that she's experiencing at the hands of the fellow congregants. So it's not a necessarily pure relationship to God or to the religion, but she's a fervent believer as a child. And I think it isn't until her brother's addiction that she starts to pull away from the church. And she describes it as happening really, really suddenly when her brother passes. Like all of a sudden, there was no God for her. But her mother remains quite devout. And I think because of that, Gifty is unable to set it aside completely. It becomes kind of this last language that she and her mother share, and so she has to keep it up because her mother needs her to in some ways.
It continues to be her connection to her mother. So how do you understand the evangelical Christian right as it's aligned with religious fundamentalism and with Trumpism in our divided nation?
Not an easy question, Karen. It's. I also grew up in the church. This is where I reveal that. I grew up Pentecostal, and similarly to Gifty, grew up in a predominantly white Pentecostal church in Huntsville, Alabama, and it was a formative place in many ways. I spent so much time there. But sooner than Gifty, and for very different reasons than Gifty, I think I started to recognize that it was a place that was not at all aligned with my kind of burgeoning political ideologies. And it's only gotten worse since I left, in ways that are really quite terrifying to me. And I think I remember distinctly, actually, the last day that I went to a youth service. I think I was 14 years old, and there was a visiting youth pastor who said to us that he had had a vision of 2 tornadoes that were coming to destroy the earth, and one was homosexuality and the other was abortion. I remember I got up and I called my parents and asked them to pick me up, and then I never went back. But that kind of thinking is just kind of rampant through the church. But I want to also say that this is specific to the white evangelical church of the South. I saw an op-ed that said there's no religious left in the country, and they're not saying the same things at Black Pentecostal churches. And so I think sometimes what my life would be like, but certainly what Gifty's life would have been like had she gone to a church across town and just been around people who thought more like she did and could welcome her family more fully. Maybe religion would not have felt so unbearable to her. Maybe it could have actually been a source of strength and part of where her kind of her desire to be good came from. So it's still among the most segregated places in the country are these churches. I think there's a reason for that.
Well, in our troubled moment of Roe v. Wade, we're about to end a constitutional right because of an interpretation of a document, our Constitution, which is kind of the Bible of our nation. Some people want to read it literally, and abortion is not in the Constitution, apparently. Yeah. Here's a question. At Harvard, Gifty has an undergraduate relationship with a young woman named Anne that ends abruptly after Gifty confesses the death of her brother to opioids. And in hearing this, Anne cries rather uncontrollably, but Gifty finds offense in Anne's reaction. And then she leaves. It's never explained, never explains anything to Anne, and never returns to that friendship. Why?
Yeah, I think this is where you see all of Gifty's bad coping mechanisms on full display. She's a person who, because of all of the chaos that she experienced in her childhood, I think often doesn't have the emotional tools to react in ways that that would benefit her. If she had accepted Anne's empathy in that moment, if she had continued that friendship, her life would be a little less hard for a number of years than it turned out to be. But I don't think she can, because she doesn't know how. You know, she's raised by a woman who mirrors her in a lot of ways, even though I think Gifty would kind of protest any comparison to her mother. There is that emotional distance, that reticence, that unwillingness to be vulnerable and to talk about emotions and to talk about feelings. And part of that is learned, but also part of that is protective. You know, she's been hurt. And so I think when she sees that moment with Anne, what she's thinking is, how is this going to hurt me? And so she runs from it rather than running toward it. And it costs her something, I think.
Well, it's a moment in the narrative. It's a key moment that's abandoned in the narrative, but yeah. And a deep insult is never explained. So I too felt that she was too young to, and so she has to grow through the novel, and you see her begin to understand her friendships better as time goes on. But is there something to be understood here about Africans as American immigrants? Hmm?
Certainly not all of them, but I think, you know, there is some of that, you know, reluctance to have that really. What I think of, even still, like I think of it as very American to like always say I love you to your family, but it depends on the family. But mine wasn't like that. And so I think there are these kind of learned things within different communities that kind of feel different. I earlier on in the touring process for Transcendent Kingdom, somebody asked me if Gifty and her mother love each other, which felt like a ridiculous question to me, because I see love all through this relationship. but it's not explicit. It's not said explicitly. It's shown in very different ways, and so that's how I think of it.
I recognize that in my own community, my own family. This demonstration of hugging each other, that love and all the, and I think my friends were always surprised. My other Asian American friends, they would always say, my mother never hugged me, and so this revelation's like, yeah, and that sense that because there was not that show of affection, that there wasn't love there, but of course there was. And also coming from an Asian American immigrant community, this urge to higher overachievement, and yet the hidden shame of our bodies. Why does Gifty move from Harvard to Stanford to Princeton? I mean, since we're here at UC Santa Cruz, why these elite universities?
Well, I think in part it was what you were talking about before. Gifty doesn't have parents who are intense about her education, like they're not checking her report cards, and yet I think there is a part of her that feels like she's always talking about how she has to be good, has to be the best, though she doesn't always put it that way. And so I think that's where that comes from. The other place that it comes from is Tina, who went to those schools.
But she's Asian. Okay, at the very end, Gifty says, I've seen enough in a mouse to understand transcendence, holiness, redemption. In people, I've seen even more. What is the meaning here of transcendence or of the Transcendent Kingdom?
In that passage that you just quoted from, I think it's this idea of becoming or moving beyond this place of difficulty, moving beyond the place that you thought you could move beyond. As far as the idea of Transcendent Kingdom, it comes from the earlier moment in this novel where Gifty's talking about a teacher that she had who said something along the lines of, humans are the only animals who believe that they have transcended their kingdom. And she's talking about the classification, kingdom, phylum, class, order. So humans are an animal that don't think of themselves as animals. And that felt really fitting for a book that was asking so many questions about what it means to be human, to think about what Gifty sometimes calls the whole animal. Like, how do we move beyond what we see as the kind of limits of our humanity?
And I think that brings us to maybe your next project. Can you talk about it? No. You don't have to. Don't tell them.
I'm too superstitious to say anything specific, but I have started something, and it's still quite early, so hard to know what it will be ultimately. But I'm thinking a lot about animals again, and thinking a lot about the planet. That's as much as I'll say.
Right. I think I was given the 5-minute message, so we'll stop there, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Yaa. So now we have some time for your questions. All right, well, I'll just start with a couple questions. You read beginnings from both your books. And maybe that was in case somebody hadn't read it and you wouldn't spoil anything that had happened. But it made me start to wonder, it's a question for both of you. Karen, to you too. When do you write your beginnings?
I write mine first. Like I've only ever written chronologically, and it's a horrible process. I don't recommend this to anyone who wants to be a writer, but for me, the way that it has worked is again, because I don't outline, I'll write my way into it. So I'll write a beginning, and 30 pages in, 40 pages in, I'll realize this isn't it and throw it out, and then write a new one. That's not it. It's like trying to fit, like as though I had a big set of keys and I'm trying to fit them into a specific lock, and once I can open the door, I'm like, oh, this is the book. And it always feels like this moment of recognition, like seeing somebody on the street. Like I'll write the beginning and recognize it and say, oh, that's the book, this is it, and then I can finish from there, but not until I have the beginning.
So it's like the front door.
Yeah.
Okay. Karen, what about you?
I think it's been different with every book. It's different. Right, this past one, I wrote a short story, which turned in the chapter that's in the middle of the book, so I'm not sure. But call me Ishmael. I mean, who can beat that? It's kind of hard. So I'm not gonna. Yeah, but once the first sentence comes in, I think you can break through. You're right. I think you're right.
So you were talking a little bit about risk-taking, and it occurred to me that being a writer is risky business. And I wondered at what point in your lives you both decided or became committed to the writing life, and did you have any resistance?
I think I knew from a really young age. I was telling the students earlier, the first thing I ever wrote, I wrote when I was 7 for the Reading Rainbow Young Writers and Illustrators competition. And
Yes, applause for Reading Rainbow.
I was a devoted Reading Rainbow fan. I wrote a story called Just Me and My Dog, about a little girl who desperately wants a dog. Thinly veiled autobiography. And I didn't know at that point that writing was a profession that you could have, so I wasn't saying to people that I wanted to write, but I was always writing. And I think it was probably high school when I started to kind of admit to people that I wanted to be a writer, kind of just testing the waters. And there was lots of resistance. I have the kind of cliche immigrant parent thing where it was just not acceptable to them that I would become a writer. But I couldn't see myself doing anything else, and I really loved it, and I felt so strongly about it that I think I won them over just by my refusal to do what they wanted me to do.
Yeah, I'm asking for a humanities dean who would like to convince more students and parents to major in humanities.
Oh, you're going to ask me?
Yeah, you too.
Oh, I work for PBS. I mean, I was just a secretary in the engineering department, so maybe I, saw you in those days.
I should say I didn't win. I didn't win the competition, but
Did you get the dog?
I did not get it. I have one now, but my parents never got me a dog. Yeah.
I was never good at anything else.
Find that very hard to believe, but okay. Okay, Karen. Okay, one question from the audience. As you wrote Homegoing, was there anything in your life, career or personal, that pulled you away from the book? Was it ever in doubt that you'd finish writing it?
Oh, I was in doubt every second of every day that I worked on it. I started it when I was still in undergrad, and so there was so much pulling me away. When I talked about those first 3 years of false starts, I think part of it was that I didn't really know what I was doing, and there were so many other things making demands on my attention and time. But I was fortunate enough to go to a grad program that really just, the only thing you were expected to do was to work on what you wanted to work on. And so it was 2 years of uninterrupted time to devote to Homegoing. And I think that's when it became a book for me.
So we have a couple questions here that are pretty similar that I will ask to both of you. What advice would you give to young aspiring writers? Or what do you wish someone would have told you as you were starting? Karen, do you want to start?
Well, I always tell my students to leave the place that you are familiar with, you know. But maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe your parents don't want that; they wouldn't think that's a good idea. But I left for Brazil, and I had to make my way there for a while, learn another language, be with other people, see my home from a different perspective, and I thought that was very useful for my growing up and my maturity and for my understanding what it was to be an American.
I think the thing I say most often is to read as much as possible, which feels like an easy answer, but it's really the truest way that I can think of to get better. I don't know how it happens, and yet I do know that it's the stone that you sharpen your writing on. Like if you don't keep reading and keep your love of other books alive, the things that you write won't be as good. So that's probably my biggest piece of advice.
So this sort of follows up on that. What helps keep your creativity alive? What makes you feel most alive and eager to write? Go ahead, Karen.
Eating. I love to cook and spend time in the kitchen, and I love to look at recipes. I love to gather people around my home and cook for them, and to hear their stories and to be with other people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes from everywhere, and so the more you kind of put yourself into the world, engage with other people, other places, the more it feeds your creativity and other people's ideas too, going back to reading as much as possible. Or even, I mean, watching good movies, you know, anywhere can kind of inform your creativity.
Do you usually have a clear idea for a resolution to your story in mind at the beginning of writing it? We talked about beginnings, so now I guess we're talking about endings. Do you see the resolution at the start or the end?
I did with Homegoing only in the sense that because I had this family tree that was acting as my like chapter outline. I knew when I got to Marcus I was at the end. So I knew in that sense, and I also knew that I wanted the two sides to meet, but I didn't know the specifics. And then with Transcendent Kingdom, I had no idea what the ending would be until I got there.
For you, Karen?
Sometimes, yeah, I do know the ending, and I'm working toward it. Other times I don't. I couldn't say. It's different.
So it's not necessary. You don't need to know the end. You can just get yourself there.
Well, probably that's wrong to say that, because I do have a structure. All my work is structured before, and so there's a structural pattern. But what the last sentence is, I don't know.
All right, here's a question specifically about Gifty. Gifty doesn't quite fit in any of the communities she's part of, her church, her family, her fellow scientists. Can you talk about her outsider status and why you wanted to show her as an outsider in so many contexts.
Yeah, for me it was so much of this book is about loneliness and trying to kind of navigate that feeling of isolation. And so, I think even just the act of immigrating can be such a lonely experience. So she's already starting out with that first kind of formative isolation. But then each one kind of adds these layers that create this sense of an absence or a lack. And she keeps trying to fill it and keeps trying to find it. But I think it all begins with as that question asks, the sense of being outside of everything. And I think it's, in some ways, like it can help her because she can see things that other people who are in it can't see. But in other ways, it makes her quite lonely.
So speaking of loneliness, we have a question here about friendship. So you talked a little bit about love and love between mother and daughter. This person asks about friendship and finds it absent in the novel and wonders, because friendship is so important, it says especially female to females, is the absence of it in the novel based on your own life experience or something you wanted to communicate about the characters?
Not based on my own life experience. I think one of the most rich aspects of my life is my friendships. But I don't think it's absent for Gifty. I don't think she's great at them, as we talked about with Anne. But I do think that she has people in her life who keep trying to kind of draw out that friendship. Anne, Catherine is another example. So I do think she has it, but she's not, as we talked about before, like she's not necessarily very good at doing the reciprocal thing of kind of reaching out to those friends who are reaching out toward her.
All right, so we've got another question about endings, and specifically the ending in Transcendent Kingdom. Slightly spoiler alert. If you haven't read the book yet, you might want to cover your ears. So Gifty says she will no longer search for answers within this is hard to read, scientific nor spiritual community. Do you actually envision her settled, or is she really burying her questions?
I think neither. I think it feels like a pause, this moment where you get to see her not as consumed by all of these questions and that kind of relentless just thrumming of her mind. But I don't know that she's the kind of person where everything could be settled. But I think she's reached a place where she can feel just a small measure of peace. So I suppose that is a version of being settled. But I assume that she's going to get up from that seat in the church and kind of continue to do what she's always done, which is ask these kind of questions. So I don't think she's completely settled, and I don't think she's buried anything. She's just a little more at ease than she is throughout the novel.
All right, we have a question from a high school teacher. I hope we've got other high school teachers out in the Deep Read audience. Yes. This teacher is currently teaching Homegoing and wants to know what you hope her high school students get out of your novel.
Well, thank you for teaching it. I think for me, the most important thing that one could get out of Homegoing is this understanding that, things don't just happen and then disappear, that where we are in the present is always informed by everything that came before. And so history isn't this discrete thing that happens and then ends. It continues to ripple out. So if your students start to make connections between the things that they're seeing in the world now and the things that have come before, I think that would be one wonderful thing to get from the book.
So for both of you, this is a kind of two-part question, and it picks up a little bit on, I think, Karen, you were getting at the role of intergenerational trauma. You were talking about historical trauma. And I'm wondering if you could talk, both of you, a little bit more about what kind of impact you think literature can have on bringing light to that trauma, or in fact helping us work through it.
I mean, I think one thing that literature is really good for is allowing us to kind of confront these spaces that we might not confront otherwise. I'm going to butcher the quote, but James Baldwin says something like, you think that you're the only person to have ever felt something or see something, and then you read a book and there it is. And so that sense of being able to name the thing that you know to be true, but you haven't seen articulated before. I think literature is really wonderful for that, and that's one of the ways that it can address a question of intergenerational trauma.
Well, certainly for my family, I couldn't write really about what happened to my family because they wouldn't talk about it. And yet I knew that their having been in camp, been incarcerated during World War II, that it had affected everything about our lives and our family and the way they were protective of us and the way we were raised. And I didn't understand that until many years later. So yes, it became really important to begin to take a look at that period, to write about it, and to think about it in terms of stories to share with others. And yeah, literature can do that. You're right.
So that makes me think about silence and the kind of important role that silence can play. And I'm just wondering, maybe in Transcendent Kingdom, seems like that could be the book we talk about. What do you think are the most important silences?
Well, there are so many silences in this book. There's so many things that we'll never really know about Gifty's mother because she never tells Gifty her stories. And so Gifty kind of carries the weight of her mother's silences throughout. And in some ways, again, it can be generative because it makes her such a questioning person. But in other ways, I think it has really kind of deeply harmed her too, to not have these stories and to not know more and to live within those silences. So I think it's everywhere.
You both talked a little bit about loving books and obviously loving reading, but also what got you excited was connection, was cooking, talking with friends, bringing people together. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why, I'm hoping you think it's important, but why you think these kinds of big reads or deep reads or community reads are important. Why is it important that we read in community? Karen, do you want to go this time? Or maybe it's just important to eat in community.
Well, hasn't it been wonderful to read Gifty's work? I mean, I'm not Gifty, but I mean Yaa's work and Gifty's story. And we all can, it's like being in a gigantic book club where we can all share these stories and then think about them in many complicated and interesting ways. And I know from the panel a week ago where the chancellor and who is a scientist and my my colleague Valashni, who is in literature, and my other colleague, Gina, who is in feminist studies, and Laura Martin, all had very different perspectives on your book and ways to bring it together for an audience. And all of them made us think further about what's going on there in that work. And it's very, very rich. It's very, very rich for conversation. I think you'll all agree that it's been a very, very rich conversation. We've learned a great deal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. I think something really beautiful happens when you read in community, which is that everybody brings their own unique perspectives to bear on the book, and something that maybe is important to you, something that you kind of latch on to, might be different from what your neighbor latches on to. Now that I've been on tour with 2 books, it's amazing to me to hear from readers what meant the most to them, what parts of the book resonated with them. It's always different from person to person, and I think that's a great and really wonderful thing about that relationship between reader and writer, and you get to see it all together because you are all reading the same book.
I think we have got time for one more question. This is to both of you. What is the most fun book and poem for you? It's a slightly different version of what's your favorite. What's your favorite novel, or what are you reading right now?
I'm trying to think of like, fun is not a word that I often ascribe to some of the often quite sad books that I read, even though I loved them. But what would be a fun book or a fun poem? Oh, I read a book last year called Olympus, Texas by Stacey Swan. It's very operatic, this kind of reimagining of Greek tales, like operatic, melodramatic. I don't mean that in a negative way. Like, it was just fun is the word that I would use. Yeah.
Any fun books or poems coming to mind, Karen?
I mean, I enjoy all the reading. I mean, whether it's fun or not. I mean, not, you don't mean funny, right? I just finished what's her name? Valeria Luiselli's book, Archive of Lost Children. It's not a fun book, but it's a gorgeous book, and it was tender and heartbreaking, very moving book about immigrant children and lost children in so many ways, and I thought she's a fabulous writer, and so I recommend it.
Yeah, any other not fun recommendations?
Not fun recommendations, but amazing still recommendations. I loved The 5 Wounds by Kirsten Valdez Quaid that came out in 2020. You said funny, which made me think of my favorite funny writer, whose books are also really quite sad. But it's a Canadian writer named Miriam Toews. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's spelled Toews. Great. And she has, my favorite of her novels is called All My Puny Sorrows. And then she has another one called Women Talking that's amazing. So any of her books, quite funny, but very sad.
Any others you want to add, Karen, to our reading list right now?
I haven't been reading anything funny.
Well, thank you, Yaa. Thank you, Karen. Thank all of you out there for joining us this afternoon. So there will be a book signing for the next half hour or so at the top of the bowl in Quarry speak, which I think means that way. Yep, where you came in. And there are plenty of places. So if you didn't get a number at the top of the event, you're welcome to get in line and get your book signed. Why wouldn't you do that? And I also want to, in addition to thanking you all, say how much I look forward to reading with you for the Deep Read 2023. Thank you.